The Legend of Blake, Escalation. Blake sat comfortably in the enormous hand of the Goblin Giantess Floni. The gentle afternoon breeze and the warmth of the midday sun felt like a tender embrace as she gazed out over the endless canopy of the forest. The skin of Floni's hand beneath her was warm, rough, and full of life, the giant fingers barely moving, yet always positioned to ensure the queen wasn't at risk of falling. "You're better than any carriage," Blake remarked casually, looking up at Floni's massive face. "Oh, really?" Floni replied in her booming voice. "I do hope my hand is a comfortable mode of transport for you, my queen." "Oh, it is. Absolutely." Blake savored the moment, enjoying the sight of the trees below, the feel of Floni's movements, and simply being with her giant friend. It was wonderful. With each thunderous step the giantess took, Blake could feel the power in Floni's muscles. The ground trembled with every stride, and the rhythm of her footsteps was strangely soothing, just like the pulsing heartbeat of this giant being who had become her closest friend. Trees snapped with loud cracks as Floni effortlessly walked through the dense forest, as if the trees were no more than blades of grass beneath her green feet. After a while, Floni came to a stop. She bent down gently and carefully allowed Blake to climb off her massive hand, moving with deliberate care to avoid accidentally hurting the queen. But of course, she was gentle enough. Since becoming a giantess, Floni had learned how to handle the smaller folk with great care. Blake stepped onto the soft forest floor and looked out over the clearing. It was the same spot where she and Floni had truly gotten to know each other for the first time. A peaceful, secluded oasis in the heart of the forest, surrounded by a small waterfall and a clear lagoon. The sound of rushing water blended with the distant calls of birds. Countless pollen particles and glowing insects drifted through the sunlit air, giving the place an almost magical aura. Floni settled down next to the waterfall, her enormous legs stretched out as she looked down at Blake. "Why are we here, my queen? Was there a particular reason you asked me to bring you here?" She asked, her voice gentle but formal, almost as if she were speaking to a superior rather than a friend. Blake sighed softly and looked up at the sky before collecting her thoughts. "You know, I'm exhausted, Floni. The politics, the intrigues, the constant expectations, it all becomes too much sometimes. Every decision I make, every choice I enforce is questioned and debated. The people of the kingdom expect strength, clarity, and wisdom from me, and yet I often feel so lost, so weighed down." Floni nodded in understanding, her massive green eyes fixed on Blake, though the distance between them still felt palpable. "I understand, but if I may say so, you've done an incredible job so far. There's never been such a good relationship between humans and goblins as there is now, and for that I'm truly grateful to you." Blake shook her head and smiled sadly. "Thank you, Floni. Somehow it's worked so far, largely thanks to your help. But what I really need is just a break. I need to be able to switch off sometimes, to rest. I need a place where I don't have to be the queen, where I can just be myself, and where we can spend time together. You know, your friendship is the most important thing in my life now." Wow. Floni didn't know how to respond. She liked the queen very much too, but she hadn't expected Blake to value her so deeply. Feeling a little embarrassed, she said, "I know you're very busy, but we do spend time together now and then in the castle courtyard, and I'm very grateful that I have a permanent place there now and that your servants even built that large roof to keep me dry when it rains. It's a wonderful gesture and a comfortable home for me." Blake nodded. "Yes, that's true. It's nice having you close by, and I love our evening talks whenever we have the time. But it's still different in the courtyard. It's different even in the city or nearby lands. There are always people around, and we must keep up appearances, at least to some degree." Floni furrowed her brow. "And you don't like that? I thought you enjoyed things like that." Blake looked up at her, noticing that Floni still carried a formal, somewhat distant demeanor. "You know, when we first met, you treated me differently. You were, how should I put it, dismissive. You didn't see me as a queen, but more like," she searched for the right words, "like a toy." Floni's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "A toy? Blake, that was a different time. Back then, I harbored a deep hatred toward humans, especially considering my past. And I honestly thought you were just another arrogant princess who saw herself as a goddess or something. But after I got to know you better, I started working for you. I respect you as my queen now. I can't treat you the way I used to. Honestly, thinking back on it now, it's embarrassing. I had you pinned between my toes, making you lick the sweat from them. That's really unforgivable. Blake gave a faint smile and shook her head. But that's exactly the point. I don't always want to be treated like a queen. I want you to treat me like you did back then. I want you to belittle me, make me feel small, even like a worthless insect beneath your feet. I know it sounds strange, but it gives me something I can't find anywhere else. Floni stared at her in silence for a moment, clearly confused. Blake, you're the most powerful person in the land. I mean, I know you like my feet, but why would you want me to treat you like a worthless insect? That wouldn't be very kind of me, would it? Blake sighed deeply, stepping closer to Floni, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to find the right words. Because I need it. Under your feet, I feel lighter, like all my worries disappear. Do you understand? For just a moment, I can forget everything. The crown, the responsibilities, the weight of my choices. It's like for a brief time, I can be someone else. Helpless, yes, but in that helplessness, I find a strange kind of peace. I'm nothing more than an insect at your mercy, maybe even crushed beneath you. That's so freeing. I didn't realize it during our first encounter because those feelings were so new to me. But now I long for it. Floni frowned, still uncertain. So you want me to treat you the way I did back then? You mean you liked how I acted, even though I was so rough? Blake nodded slowly. Yes, I know it's unusual, but that's what I like about you. And our friendship means more to me than anything else. I trust you, Floni, more than anyone. Floni gazed at Blake for a moment longer before she finally nodded, a mischievous smile spreading across her lips. If this is what you want, Blake, then I will gladly grant your wish. A mischievous smile crossed Floni's face as she straightened up a bit and pushed her enormous feet closer to Blake. But don't complain if my feet are sweaty. After all, I've been on them for hours, she added, her voice lighter now, almost playful. Blake stood still, her eyes following Floni's massive feet as they slowly approached. They were beautifully shaped and so unbelievably large that Blake felt utterly tiny next to them. Don't worry, I like it even more that way. Floni placed one of her feet directly in front of Blake, her heel touching the ground, while the sole and toes loomed high above her. And how's the view, Queen? Blake? The dark-skinned queen stepped closer to the enormous foot until she touched it and gently pressed herself against the skin. It's truly beautiful. Gorgeous. And you're really gigantic, Floni. You could easily crush me like a bug. Floni grinned. That's right. It would be very easy for me. Your body is so fragile. You wouldn't stand a chance against my weight. Her massive soles were indeed quite sweaty from the long trek through the forest. The skin glistened in the sunlight, and a thin sheen of moisture slowly dripped in large droplets down her rough heels and the balls of her feet. Floni's feet were tough but well-formed, with thick toes and skin from walking barefoot all the time. The smell wafting from them was intense, an earthy scent mixed with the sweat and grime of the forest. Blake inhaled the scent, and though she knew most would find it unpleasant, she found it almost intoxicating. It reminded her of the raw, untamed power that radiated from Floni, a wild, natural energy that both fascinated and calmed her. You can be pretty cute sometimes, Blake. Floni teased lightly as she lifted her enormous foot over the queen. The massive, sweaty sole hovered just inches above Blake's head, the hot, moist air beneath it enveloping Blake like a heavy curtain. Go on, lie down, and I'll pretend to really crush you underfoot. All right? Blake didn't hesitate. She knelt down and then lay flat on the ground, positioning herself directly beneath Floni's hovering foot. As the gigantic soul descended slowly, she felt the warmth and then the pressure on her body, the soft, sweaty skin pressing against her own. The smell intensified, but Blake closed her eyes and let herself fully embrace the moment. The pressure increased as Floni gently rested her foot on Blake, being careful not to press too hard. She could never forgive herself if she hurt the queen, her best friend. Blake could feel the warmth of the soul, the faint pulse of Floni's heartbeat through her skin, and she was completely enveloped by the sensation of power emanating from the Goblin Giantess. It was as though the world around her had vanished, and only Floni's foot and the weight upon her existed. And Blake loved it. It wasn't just the physical beauty of Floni's feet, the rough lines and natural strength they embodied. It was the psychological release, the feeling of being overwhelmed while also being completely detached from her responsibilities. Here, beneath Floni's feet, she was not a queen but just a tiny little insect, helpless and powerless at the mercy of this giant green woman. She began to tremble, and tears streamed down her cheeks. "Your feet are so beautiful. It would be such an honor to be crushed by you, to be completely squashed. That would be a true honor." Floni watched the scene from above. She couldn't help but chuckle. It was somehow absurd that she, a goblin giantess who had once lived as a simple warrior, now had the most powerful woman in the land, the queen herself, under her foot like a small insect, and that she enjoyed it so much. And yet, it also felt strangely right. She remembered how she had once tried to humiliate Blake, how the queen had been visibly angered while Floni had simply had her fun. Who would have thought that this event would leave such deep marks on the queen's soul? And there was no reason why Floni shouldn't have a bit of fun with the situation as well. "You're really strange, you know that?" Floni teased, brushing her toes lightly over Blake's body. She could feel Blake moving beneath her foot, but there was no struggle, no panic. Blake simply let it happen, even enjoying it. Floni found it fascinating. Her massive toes swept over Blake powerfully, yet gently, the ridges of her sole forming soft curves that molded around the queen's small frame. It was a delightful sensation for the little woman. Then her toes came down, and Blake found herself nestled between them. Suddenly, Floni squeezed them together, trapping Blake with surprising force. With a shocked expression, Blake was lifted high into the air, clamped between Floni's enormous toes. Floni gazed down at the tiny queen and chuckled. "Care for a taste of my sweat?" Blake's heart raced, but she shook her head. "Don't push it, Floni." But Floni only squeezed her toes tighter. "Come on, or I'll squish you like the insect you are." Nervously, Blake obeyed, running her tongue over the ridges of Floni's skin. She tasted the salty sweat, mixed with the mineral-rich dirt clinging to the sole. Floni watched, grinning. "It's probably good for your immune system, little one." In a way, Floni took pleasure in the control she had. It was a power play that she found genuinely amusing. Yet she also sensed that this was more than just fun. Blake needed this, and that gave the situation a deeper meaning. It wasn't merely a whim or an odd indulgence. For Blake, this was a way to free herself from the weight of her responsibilities. She trusted Floni completely, and that trust filled Floni with a strange sense of pride. "I think you're the only queen who would ever let something like this happen voluntarily." Honestly, Floni laughed, but she respected Blake for daring to be so vulnerable, even if it meant being treated like a plaything. And maybe that was what made their friendship special. Despite their differences, despite the power dynamics and the strange roles they played with one another, they were honest. Blake could let go, and Floni could make her feel like everything was okay, that even though she bore great responsibility, she could also be small, insignificant, and she could let go sometimes to recharge. For quite a while, Floni continued her playful giantess act. She pretended to crush Blake, slowly squeezing her between her soles or playfully threatening to eat her. Occasionally, she would toss her into the small lake and fish her out with her toes. To an outsider, it might have looked like torture, but the two of them were simply enjoying some carefree fun. As evening fell, and Blake was once again tossed into the lake, she emerged, swimming warily toward the shore. "All right, Floni, thank you. I think we should return to the castle. The Elves sent a delegation and requested an audience this evening." Floni carefully reached out with her massive hand, gently lifting the small queen. She cradled Blake in her fingers, warming her in the cool evening air. "Oh, that sounds serious. The Elves haven't had an easy time lately." "You can say that again. First, their biggest metropolis was destroyed, and now a small town on the border of Tulania. War has already broken out, and I suspect I know what the Elves hope to ask of me." Floni stood, gazing at the little, drenched queen in her hand. "And have you decided how you'll respond?" Blake shook her head. "No, I haven't yet. The whole situation is complicated. As Floni began the journey home, walking through the forest, she spoke, "I don't want to tell you what to do, but I think at some point we'll have to act. It's already known that Tulani is planning an invasion of our land. The Elves are just the beginning. It will continue with us, and then other nations will be drawn in. This is going to be a large-scale war." Blake nodded solemnly. "I know, and that's exactly what worries me the most." Plus, as the gigantic Floni arrived at the capital city with Blake in her hand, the long shadows of the evening stretched across the city, and the sky displayed a beautiful gradient from red to purple. Floni tread carefully, ensuring she did not crush anyone beneath her powerful feet as she made her way through the narrow streets. The streets were lined with residents, gazing up at her in awe and wonder. Her steps were deliberate and slow to preserve the cobblestones and the people. From her towering height, she could see the residents looking up at her with reverence, some even waving or cheering. Floni savored the attention she now received as a mighty giantess. "Careful down there, and stay clear of my feet," Floni said with a smile as she made her way powerfully through the city. On the castle wall, Blake's attendants were already waiting, their faces marked by worry and nervousness. Among them was an older gentleman with a magnificent mustache and a finely embroidered robe. He called out anxiously as Floni approached with the queen in her hand. "My queen, where have you been so long? The delegation is already waiting in the audience hall." Floni smiled gently and leaned forward, allowing Blake to slide from her hand onto the wall. The slightly disheveled queen stood up and spoke with a determined voice. "I will quickly change and get ready. Offer the delegation food and drink until I arrive." Blake hurried to her chambers, where her maids had everything prepared. She removed her soiled clothes and saw that a bath had been drawn. "A bath won't be necessary. I've already had a rather excellent one," she said with a smile. The maids nodded respectfully and helped her into a white dress that accentuated her grace and dignity. A red sash, symbolizing her royal authority, draped softly over her shoulder. Finally, she placed the sparkling crown upon her head and took a moment to regard her reflection. Then, with renewed courage and determination, she entered the audience hall. The atmosphere in the hall was tense. The elf delegation, already seated at the table, looked weary and exhausted, their eyes framed by worry lines. The lavish feast laid out on the table remained untouched, something Blake noticed immediately. She took her place at the head of the long table and greeted the delegation with a gentle but firm voice. "Welcome, friends. Why do you not touch the food?" An elf with a serious expression rose and spoke with a heavy heart. "Queen Blake, we cannot eat after such injustice has befallen our realm. Our hearts are too heavy for nourishment." Blake nodded understandingly and leaned forward, speaking softly yet intensely. "Tell me everything. What has happened?" Although she had already received reports from Nawi, they were a few days old, and Blake feared that more had happened in the meantime. What followed was a long and heated discussion. The elves recounted the destruction of their metropolis and a small town on the border with Tulania. Tears flowed as they spoke of the losses and suffering of their people. Blake listened attentively, asking questions to understand every detail. Her own heart grew heavy as she witnessed the tears of the envoys. It was clear that they were all suffering. "We cannot leave this unanswered," one of the elves said, slamming his fist on the table. "Our alliance must stand by us. We demand support and retribution." Blake raised her hand to calm him. "I understand your anger and your pain," she said calmly, "but we must act with caution. A war will only bring more suffering upon all of us. We must find other ways." Another elf, older and wiser, bowed his head and spoke with a gentle voice. "What do you propose, Queen?" Blake made several proposals. She spoke of diplomatic negotiations, of economic sanctions against Tulania to bring them to their senses. She also mentioned possible alliances with other realms to apply joint pressure. The delegates listened intently, but the atmosphere grew increasingly tense. Finally, a young elf burst out. "We cannot afford to wait," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "Every day we delay, more of our people die. We are already at war. Suggesting sanctions is utterly ridiculous." Blake took a deep breath and placed her hands on the table. "I promise you, I will do everything within my power to secure justice for your people. but we must find a way that does not lead to more innocent lives being lost. The elves began to speak over one another, questioning how justice could be achieved without shedding blood. What kind of justice would that be? Blake listened, her heart clenching. It was becoming increasingly clear that the elves demanded what she feared the most, entering a war, harsh retaliation. Blake lowered her head, slammed her fist on the table, and then asked, "Very well. How exactly do you expect me to help you? What kind of retaliation do you have in mind?" The eldest of the elves stood up, bowed, and looked directly at Blake. "Well, your kingdom is the only one that, like Tulania, possesses giants. We request that your giants bring the same level of destruction to Tulania as they have brought upon us." Suddenly, a loud giggle was heard from outside. The elves flinched and looked towards the windows facing the courtyard, where they saw a giant greenish eye watching them. "You want me to go to Tulania and trample their cities?" Floni asked, amused. The elf was somewhat indignant and turned back to Blake. "You failed to mention that you had giants here and that they would be eavesdropping on us." Blake replied, "This is Floni, my chief military advisor, and in fact, the only giantess my kingdom possesses. Given her position, she is essential to these discussions, but as you can imagine, she is way too large for this room, so she participates from the castle courtyard." The elf calmed down. "That is acceptable, but why do you say she is the only giantess? According to our information, you have 3. Blake shook her head. "Those are just rumors, and people often exaggerate in their tales. But we saw footprints of immense size on our way here." Blake nodded. "Yes, that is true. Those footprints belong to other giants not from Zaya. These giants were actually from a completely different world and were just passing through. Nevertheless, they helped us immensely." The elf nodded. "I see, you received help, and now we ask for your help. No, we beg for it." Blake sighed and approached the window. "Floni, what do you think?" Floni's enormous face displayed a grin. "Well, I would love to trample cities and people again, and if it hits the right targets, all the better. And I can understand the elves well, considering my past." Blake pondered. "I know, but is it really right to demand innocent lives? What the government of Tulania does and decides has little to do with the general populace. Well, at least not much." "You already recognize it yourself, don't you?" Floni asked more seriously. "If the land and the government do wrong, then the people also bear the responsibility to oppose it or leave the country. For the power of the king comes from the people." "Hear, hear," called the eldest of the elves. "One can still hear words of reason in these times." Blake sighed again. "So be it. Floni, I order you to completely destroy 2 cities in Tulania and trample all the inhabitants there, just as the Tulania giantess did to the inhabitants of the elven cities." Floni grinned broadly upon hearing this, her heart beginning to beat fast and heavily. She tried in vain to hide her anticipation, for she longed intensely to fully exert her power, and once again feel countless helpless people being crushed beneath her sensitive soles. But her expression became somewhat more serious when she saw Blake's sad face at the window. The queen added, I have already made some preparations for this case. Tomorrow morning at 8, you will be provided with equipment, provisions, and companions." Floni was surprised to hear that. She had no idea what Blake had prepared. Then Blake turned to the elves. "Well, you have heard my decision. I hope you are satisfied." The elves all bowed, and the elder said, "Indeed, we thank you with all our hearts and are deeply in your debt, Queen Blake." Blake sat down at the table and felt dizzy. Let us all hope and pray that with this decision, we have not decreed the downfall of our realms. About a week ago in the realm of Tulania, a young librarian named Telsur, wearing a pointed hat, stood on a tall ladder, scanning the countless books on a massive shelf. His eyes wandered over the various titles until he finally found the sought-after book. Suddenly, he heard a voice, startling him so much that he nearly fell from the ladder. However, he managed to hold on just in time. Recovering from the shock, he carefully descended and placed the old book on the table, then turned to greet the lady who had just entered. The light streamed through the open door, highlighting the majestic appearance of the red-haired lady, who wore a silk gown and introduced herself as Asabella. You are the sister of the king, are you not? To what do I owe the honor of your visit?" Telsur asked, his voice trembling with reverence. Asabella replied with a slight smile. I am seeking a particular art of the Vumara, and it has come to my attention that you are a master of Vumara magic. And, how shall I put it, I understand a bit about magic, at least the usual things taught at the Royal Academy, and I am curious. Telsor shook his head and explained, It is by no means magic, Your Highness. Magic refers to things that cannot be explained. Yet since the discovery of electricity a few years ago, we have gained new insights that can explain this phenomenon. Not completely, but sufficiently. Asabella nodded thoughtfully. I have heard of electricity, but I do not know what it is. Allow me to show you, said Telsor, leading her into a back room that served as a small laboratory. In the center of the room stood a peculiar device with wires and metallic components. This is a lightning generator, Telsor explained. It generates electricity, which discharges at a certain point. As he said this, a small spark shot along the wires. Asabella regarded the device in fascination and murmured, It looks like magic. Telsor smiled and began to explain, the human brain also functions through electrical impulses. Thoughts are like lightning bolts that cannot be seen but can still influence matter. By generating and controlling these electrical impulses, we can achieve incredible things. That is astonishing, said Asabella as she admired the lightning generator. How can these impulses influence the world around us? Electricity is a fundamental force of nature, Telsor continued. Everything in the universe consists of small particles that carry electrical charges. Because our thoughts are made of energy, just as matter contains energy, one can learn to influence matter through the power of thought. Asabella looked at Telsor with wide eyes. Does that mean that one could also use the energy, let's say in my body, to make me grow gigantic? Telsor gave her a meaningful look. Ah, I see. You are also amazed by the giantess who appeared recently. And now you wish to become a giantess yourself? Asabella nodded eagerly. Yes, indeed. To be honest, I do not necessarily agree with the actions of the giantess who now claims to be of noble birth. And as the king's sister, should I not possess greater power? Do you not think so? Telsor rubbed his forehead, struggling for words. Well, it's not easy to learn this power. As far as I know, there is only one person who possesses this ability, and they have vanished. Asabella pressed on. But surely there are records, aren't there? The librarian walked over to his desk and pointed to the book he had just retrieved from the shelf. As fate would have it, I found this book just as you entered. I, too, am interested in this art, for it is crucial to maintain a balance of power. For some reason, giants have been appearing more frequently lately, despite not being seen for centuries. There you have it. This is no coincidence. It is destiny. I will ensure the balance of power, Asabella declared enthusiastically. The librarian shook his head. There is no such thing as destiny. Such superstitious beliefs are common among other peoples, but our nation strives to be more advanced than the rest of the world. So I kindly ask you to adhere to proper etiquette, my lady. Besides, I have not yet delved into these documents myself, but I can tell you this. Mastering the Vumara arts is always exceedingly difficult, and only the most intelligent and determined individuals can achieve it. Feeling slightly insulted, Asabella grinned condescendingly. Well, I am exceptionally clever and a quick learner. Teach me, and I will reward you handsomely. Telsor pondered for a moment, then looked Asabella directly in the eyes. This art is not meant to be misused. To be honest, I am not entirely supportive of your brother's politics. How can I be sure you will use it for good, unlike Lyra, who brings only death and destruction? Asabella thought for a moment and then replied charmingly, Tell me what I must do to prove that I stand on your side, and I will do it. Telsor didn't need to think long. Tell me, the king still has the elven princess and some of her servants in captivity, doesn't he? Asabella nodded. Well, most of the servants have already been executed and burned on the trash heap. But yes, the princess and one servant are still alive. However, they're scheduled for ceremonial execution tomorrow during the king's speech. There you go, said Telsor. That's a perfect opportunity, Maya, if you free the princess without your brother finding out. And ideally, so that he's publicly humiliated tomorrow, then we have a deal. Asabella had to think about this proposal for a moment, but then she finally agreed. She took Telsor's hand. That's acceptable to me. Well then, I'll be watching the ceremony very attentively tomorrow. The next day, Telsor stood in the large square where a massive crowd had gathered to witness the king's announced speech. The king, dressed in opulent robes and full of self-importance, began his speech, which was, as always, laced with pompous arrogance and his own supposed greatness. With each new phrase, he embellished himself with heroic deeds and exaggerated virtues, and gradually the crowd grew restless, many now only half listening. But Telsor was all ears, awaiting what was about to unfold with keen anticipation. After a while, the king raised his hands and announced with a triumphant voice, "Now, my loyal subjects, I present to you the captured elven princess, who will finally meet her judgment today, a symbol of the power and inviolability of our kingdom." When he signaled the executioner, the man stepped forward heavily, but his face was pale and anxious. Clearing his throat nervously, he announced, "Your Majesty, the princess, she's gone, along with her last servant." An astonished murmur rippled through the crowd. People whispered and exchanged confused glances, and the tension of the moment transformed into open bewilderment. The king, gripped by shock, stared at the executioner, speechless. For a brief moment, a heavy silence fell, revealing the full extent of his loss of control and security. There was no doubt. Someone had betrayed him, and it was abundantly clear that he had failed to prevent it or even keep his prisoners under secure guard. His power was weakened, and everyone here could clearly see it. Amidst the crowd, Telsor stood with a broad grin, relishing the sight of the king beginning to lose his composure. This was the beginning of the political turmoil that would soon plague the king over and over. Telsor would see to it. Suddenly, Telsor noticed a familiar figure beside him. Isabella stood there, her eyes glinting with quiet pride, and with a slight smile she asked, "So, how was the show?" Telsor tilted his head, giving her a scrutinizing look. "Tell me, where is the princess now?" Isabella lifted her chin slightly and replied calmly, "Don't worry, she's in the library waiting, securely tied and out of sight." Telsor nodded with satisfaction. "Good. Then we can begin training today if you wish." Meanwhile, in the land of Zaya, Floni was still weary, yet had forced herself to rise. Half asleep and bleary-eyed, she sat before the grand gate of the castle courtyard, waiting for Blake or her servants to appear. Why had Blake insisted on meeting at 8, only to be late herself? Floni nearly drifted back to sleep when the relatively small gate behind her opened, and Blake stepped through with a retinue of servants. "Good morning, my friend. How do you fare?" Blake's voice held a mixture of affection and concern. Floni blinked her eyes open, sitting straighter. "Me? Oh, I'm fine. Everything's all right." Blake sighed. "I am worried. Your mission, even if it seems like fun to you, will cost many lives, and I fear something may happen to you as well. After all, there is a giantess in Tulania who acts without mercy and is said to be even larger than you." Floni waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, don't worry, my queen. I can look after myself." "I truly hope so," Blake replied, a hint of doubt lingering in her voice. "And to help ensure your safety, I had something prepared some time ago." At this, a large group of servants marched forward, bearing a long, covered object on a heavy cart. Floni gazed down eagerly, eyes fixed on the small hands reaching up to unveil the gift. She pulled back the cloth herself, and underneath lay a massive dagger, crafted perfectly to match her size as a giantess, forged from the finest steel. Filled with awe, she took the small, yet perfectly fitting weapon into her hands, examining the holster as she strapped it to her belt. As her eyes fell upon the hilt, she noticed an engraving, delicate but unmistakable. "For Floni, my cherished friend." Her gaze softened as she turned to Blake and offered her heartfelt thanks. Yet Blake simply shook her head, hinting there was still more. More carts rolled up, bearing a set of leather armbands and knee guards, each piece reinforced with iron and adorned with gold. Blake explained, "It's not a complete armor set, but it should provide a giantess like you with some additional protection." Floni slid on the armbands and knee guards, marveling at the fine craftsmanship. Her eyes gleamed with emotion, and deeply moved, she knelt before the tiny queen, bowing low. "How could I ever repay you?" Blake flushed, looking slightly embarrassed, and then murmured, "Please let me kiss your soul one last time before you go." A gentle blush crept up Floni's cheeks, but she obeyed without hesitation. She stood and raised her bare foot lightly above Blake, allowing the little queen to reach her massive green soul. Blake stepped forward, pressing a tender kiss to the warm, rough skin. Then she whispered, "And Floni, please, come back safely." Setting her colossal foot beside the queen, Floni smiled down gently. "I'll do my best." At that moment, Nawi, the tiny elf girl with glowing wings, fluttered over and perched lightly on Floni's shoulder. She gave the giantess a playful wink. "I'll accompany you, and if needed, I'll report back." Floni looked at her, surprised, then nodded in understanding. "Oh, that makes sense. With your wings, I imagine you'd be the fastest messenger we could ask for, right?" Floni strode cautiously through the city streets, her steps gentle and measured. People cheered from every corner. Many called her name and waved with admiration as her towering legs swept gracefully above them, her strides spanning entire rows of houses at a time. The kind-hearted Goblin Giantess was famed for her courage, and the crowd knew she was setting off on a dangerous mission to bring the justice the elven folk, her dear allies, so deeply yearned for. Sitting atop Floni's shoulder was Nawi, the little elf girl who peered down curiously, observing how Floni placed each foot with meticulous care to avoid harm. When the crowd grew thick, Floni patiently waited for the people to clear a path before moving forward again. "How do you manage it?" Nawi whispered in near reverence as Floni paused once more to let a group of children pass. "So cautious and gentle." Floni smiled thoughtfully. "I'm not always like this," she murmured softly, just loud enough for Nawi to hear. "But these people are my friends. They've all accepted me as Blake's military advisor, even though I'm different. Now they cheer for me and show me respect, even love. Why should I bring harm to them when they place such trust in me? Of course I have to be as careful as possible." Nawi nodded, deep in thought. She remembered the actions of the merciless giantess from Tulania, who crushed everything and everyone in her path, reducing them all to bloody stains. But here, watching Floni, she saw the exact opposite. Yet, she knew there were also tales of a different side of Floni, the warrior who knew no mercy when her goals demanded it. And, Nawi hesitated, then continued, "It's said that you, too, can be ruthless when the time comes." Floni's face darkened slightly, but she shook her head. "Anyone can be ruthless, Nawi, when it comes to defending one's home or seeking revenge." As they passed over the city gates and reached the open countryside, Floni's stride changed. The tension in her shoulders eased, and she began to take longer, more powerful strides across the meadows, leaving beautifully shaped footprints in the soft earth. Trees bent slightly beneath the gust of each step, and in between movements, Floni glanced sideways to catch Nawi's gaze. "But tell me, Nawi, are you sure you want to come along?" Floni asked suddenly, scrutinizing her tiny companion with greater care. "What you'll witness won't be pleasant. It will be brutal. When we reach the cities of Tulania." Floni paused, and a spark of fierce determination glinted in her eyes. "I will crush countless people underfoot, and I won't just be ruthless. I'll enjoy it. I will enjoy it so much when they scream in fear and their bodies burst under my weight." Nawi tilted her head, watching the giantess intently. "I understand, Floni, but I was assigned by the delegation to accompany you, to witness the justice you bring, and to testify to all that unfolds." The little elf's wings shimmered briefly, as if her emotions coursed through them. "Blake also asked me to join you, so I can report back, in case anything goes wrong." Floni nodded slowly, contemplative. "That's wise," she admitted, turning her gaze back to the wilder landscape stretching ahead. "Things could get complicated if the other giantess shows up. I think I can defeat her, especially if she's just a spoiled noble, but one can never be certain. Many things could go awry." Nawi leaned against Floni's neck, her voice carrying an uncharacteristic intensity. "I can hardly wait to see justice served, Floni. The Tulanian people have committed unspeakable atrocities against my kind. I want them to feel the pain we endured. I want to see them crushed beneath your glorious feet, like insects." Floni's gaze remained forward, her eyes steeled with relentless resolve. "I understand, Nawi. The Tulanian people have brought suffering to many nations for too long. They were warmongers all along. Now that they have their own giantess, they believe their right to dominate is absolute. But they're mistaken. It's time they pay for their cruelty." The two continued their conversation throughout the long journey, learning more about each other. But as dusk descended, Floni decided it was time to find a place to rest. They were close to the Tulanian border, and by the next day they would reach enemy lands. For now, however, she wanted to spend the night in as much safety as possible. Spotting a clearing in the forest, she came to a stop, eyeing the place carefully. There was plenty of grass and moss, and it seemed cozy enough to settle down for the night. Floni slowly sat, removing her armor pieces and pulling out a thin woolen blanket from her large leather pack to keep her warm. "Ah, I'm so grateful the townsfolk crafted these things for me. It's such a help for a giantess like me," Floni said, draping the blanket over her extended legs. Nawi, still perched on Floni's shoulder, blushed slightly. She wasn't sure how to bring it up, but she had made a mistake. Floni?" "Yes? What is it?" I didn't bring a blanket," Nawi admitted sheepishly. Is it going to be cold tonight?" Floni glanced toward her shoulder, where the little girl with the shimmering wings sat, looking embarrassed. "But of course, Tulania's climate is a bit harsher than ours. While Zaya is warm and southern, the northern reaches of Tulania grow quite cold, especially on nights like these." The girl, already feeling the chill of the approaching night as the sun's warmth faded, asked shyly, Can I maybe sleep under your blanket too?" Floni looked down at her blanket and shook her head. "That would be too dangerous. If I were to move in my sleep, I could crush you accidentally. I could never forgive myself if that happened." She thoughtfully ran a hand through her hair, then an idea dawned on her. "But what if you wrapped yourself in my hair and slept atop my head? I think it should be safe and cozy enough. At least, I hope so." With a few flutters of her wings, Nawi lifted off and carefully landed on Floni's head. For the little fairy, Floni's thick, purple hair felt as dense as a blanket, and it radiated a comforting warmth. She nestled down and pulled a few strands over herself. "Yes, I think this will work. Thank you, Floni. I don't know how I'll ever repay you." "Oh, it's nothing," said Floni, blushing as she settled back and gently rested her head on a small hill. "Just promise me one thing. If I start scratching my head in my sleep, scream out as loud as you can, all right? I'd never want anything to happen to you." "Of course," the little fairy said, tucking herself into the purple hairs. It was surprisingly cozy atop the giant gobliness's head. Soon, both of them drifted into a deep, warm sleep. Yet the night was anything but restful for Blake. In the faint candlelight, she paced the room, heart racing faster than usual. Her mind was filled with thoughts of Floni, and every time she glanced out the window, she secretly hoped that her friend was safe out there. Worries and doubts, normally kept hidden from others, began to gnaw at her, the fear that something terrible might happen to Floni, that even the mighty goblin warrior wasn't invincible. Then, a sudden realization halted her steps. She had never truly grasped how important Floni had become to her. A life without her loyal friend and protector, the mere thought was unbearable. A knock at the door jolted her, and her heart skipped a beat. Composing herself, she called, a hint of hope in her voice. "Come in." A tall guard entered, a stern look in his eyes. "Your Majesty, I bring an urgent message," he said, bowing low. Blake studied him, puzzled as to what news could be so pressing at this hour. But before she could react, a sinister smile flickered across his face. In an instant, his demeanor shifted from humble to coldly resolute. Before she could grasp what was happening, he lunged forward, seizing her arms in a harsh grip. She gasped and struggled, but he was far stronger than she had anticipated. With practiced ease, he bound her hands and pulled out a cloth, tying it firmly around her mouth to silence her. Blake's eyes widened in terror as she struggled to break free. But the spy held her with an iron strength that left her helpless. "It's over, Your Majesty," he sneered, his grin widening. "You'll be taken to Tulania, where justice awaits. Soon, you and your giantess will face the consequences of your actions. No one will oppose our country and the will of our king." Blake's heart pounded as she tried to sound the alarm by kicking the wall, hoping the guards outside might hear. But the spy reacted swiftly. It won't be that easy." He forced her to the ground, pinning her until she gave up, powerless, on the cold stone floor. "I've already taken care of the other guards," he hissed. "So don't even think about calling for help. No one will come to your rescue." She bit against the gag, but her attempts to break free were futile. Helplessly, she was forced to follow as he led her through the castle halls and into a narrow, dark corridor. Outside the castle awaited an unremarkable wagon, where two men stood in shadow. Blake immediately sensed the grim determination in their gazes. The spy shoved her into the wagon, which set off at once. Peering out the small window, Blake watched as the castle faded into the distance. Her thoughts spun around Floni, the only one powerful and brave enough to save her. How foolish she had been. She was the one in danger. Without Floni at court, her giant protector and friend, danger lurked in every shadow. As the wagon rolled into the darkened night, thoughts of Floni dominated her mind. Was this the end? Would Floni return to find her queen dead? Was there truly no one who could save her? No one to whom she could turn for help? And then a thought surfaced. There was someone she had not dared to call for help for quite a while. In the cool twilight of the forest, Asabella and Telsor stood side by side, surrounded by the long shadows of the trees. The light cast golden patterns across the ground, and a faint rustling filled the silence as a fresh breeze stirred the leaves. This was the first test of the Vumara growth. Asabella had already made significant progress in the last few weeks, showing true dedication and determination, which had deeply impressed Telsor. He now observed her attentively and finally broke the silence. "Are you ready?" he asked softly, yet there was a firm resolve in his eyes, the kind only teachers show when they know their students are at a turning point. Asabella nodded, took a deep breath, and tried to focus on what she had learned. Her eyes narrowed as she listened inwardly, attempting to channel the power of her body and mind, but nothing happened. A faint tremor took hold of her hands, and she inhaled deeply once more, tensing every muscle in her body. Yet again, there was no change. Disappointment began to swell within her, and with each attempt, it became harder for her to hold back tears. She tried again and again, losing track of time as night deepened, but still, nothing happened. Finally, after countless failed attempts, she let her shoulders slump, her face buried in her hands. It's just not working," she whispered, her voice barely more than a sigh. "I thought I could do it, but maybe I'm just not cut out for this. Asabella, look at me." Telsor's voice was calm and warm, full of empathy. She looked up, her cheeks flushed, as if embarrassed by her own perceived weakness. "Don't give up now. Tell me, what do you truly want? What do you wish for deep in your heart? And be honest." Asabella hesitated, barely daring to meet his gaze. In her life, marked by politics and intrigue, she had almost forgotten how to speak truth, even to herself. Perhaps that was the root of the problem, and perhaps Telsor already suspected it. She wasn't even sure if she could fully trust him, or herself for that matter. Yet something in Telsor's penetrating look urged her to continue. I want power, strength, the ability to change things." Her voice shook, but she continued resolutely. "But I don't want to be in the spotlight. My brother loves it, but me? I'd rather work from the shadows, unseen. Still, I need that power." Telsor gave a thoughtful smile and seemed to ponder her words. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a golden mask. "I use this whenever I attend the alchemist gatherings. We value privacy greatly there as well. Maybe this will help you." He held the shimmering accessory out to her. "This mask will protect you and hide your identity. No one will know who you truly are when you wear it, even when you are a giant." Asabella's eyes lit up. She took the mask gingerly, as if it were a precious treasure, and placed it over her face. The moment it was on, she felt a wave of new emotion rush through her. She felt bold, different, almost like a stranger to herself. A stronger version of herself. With renewed confidence, she closed her eyes and concentrated again. Suddenly, it felt as if she were unveiling her true identity, releasing the person hidden within. She felt her pulse, and with each beat, an endless power pulsed through her body. And then, her form began to grow, slowly but irresistibly. The trees around her seemed smaller and smaller until she eventually had to look down to see their crowns. The now over 15-meter-tall Asabella threw Telsor, now as small as a mouse by her feet, an overwhelmed glance. I did it! Yes, he called out excitedly, gesturing for her to continue. "Don't stop, Asabella. Use your power to the fullest." And Asabella let it happen. Her form continued to grow until she reached an impressive height of over 50 meters. But then, the growth stopped. She concentrated once more, trying to stretch her form further, but nothing more happened. Frustrated, she let her shoulders droop. It won't go any further. Will I never be able to grow beyond this? With this height, I wouldn't even reach that arrogant Lyra's knees. Telsor stepped up to her and settled on her massive foot. He looked thoughtful, sitting there so small, gazing up at her. You know, Asabella, he began after a brief pause, the ancient giants weren't all the same size either. There were different strengths and sizes among them. Maybe it's the same for those of us who learn the Vumara art now. You know, people are different. Each of us has different limits, unique strengths. Asabella bit her lip, her thoughts swirling. So, 50 meters is my limit? Perhaps, he replied cautiously. But that doesn't mean it's a weakness. We just need to think about how to best use your unique power. Everything has its advantages and disadvantages. Trust me. Here, now, try shrinking again. All the giants who have appeared recently have only been able to grow, but so far, no one has attempted the reverse. Give it a try. Asabella closed her eyes and imagined her form shrinking back to its original size. In just a moment, she felt energy flowing out of her body. It was as if she was sinking into the ground through her soles, draining away. After only a few moments, she finally shrank down to her normal size. Relieved and proud, she looked at Telsor, her eyes shining with joy. Telsor looked at her, touched. See, you even managed it on the first try. If I had to guess, I'd say you're the quickest learner and the one who adapts knowledge the fastest. Maybe that's your special strength. Before Asabella knew what was happening, Telsor had joyfully embraced her, removed her mask, and pressed his lips against hers. The kiss was surprising, warm, and so unburdened that Asabella's heart skipped a beat. For a moment, she was speechless, but then she returned his kiss, wrapping her arms around him and feeling all her doubts and fears melt away. Another realization struck her. Over the past few weeks, she hadn't just learned a lot from him. They had genuinely grown closer. And what she had considered mere affection now revealed itself as powerful love. She pulled away from the embrace and looked at Telsor with loving eyes. You? We? But he interrupted her. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have done that. You're a noblewoman, and I'm just a librarian. But she grabbed his arm and cried, Don't say that. I am certain now. I love you. I don't care what others think. To hell with tradition. No one means as much to me as you do. And with that, she threw her arms around his neck and kissed him again. Suddenly, they heard a distant rumbling. In the silence of the night, it sounded like the rolling of wheels on rocky ground. A carriage. Asabella reluctantly broke away from Telsor and gave him a serious look. We're not alone, she whispered. He nodded. It's coming from the road over there. Come on, we'd better hide. The two of them ran behind a large tree, peeking out as the carriage passed by, with heavy rumbling and clattering wheels. In the light of the torches fixed to the carriage, Asabella caught a glimpse of the Zaya crest gleaming in the torchlight. She frowned. A carriage from Zaya? What's it doing here? She whispered. Telsor cautiously peered between the leaves, and when he recognized the uniforms of the men by the carriage, his face darkened. That's the Royal Guard. I'm afraid that means nothing good, Asabella. What? What do you mean by that? Her voice sounded almost frightened. He turned to her, his eyes serious and grim. I've suspected for a while that your brother has spies in Zaya, but for him to manage placing them so close to the Queen herself, I have to admit, it's a stroke of genius. Look at them. They're wearing the uniform of Queen Blake's personal guard. They would never come here willingly, especially not in an isolated carriage. This can only mean one thing. He hesitated, as if struggling to put an unpleasant thought into words. If that's true, then your brother now holds a very powerful trump card, the Queen of Zaya as a hostage. A shadow crossed Asabella's face as she felt a surge of anger within her. He kept that from me. Her hands balled into fists, and she looked at Telsor, upset. He told me nothing about this. He used to trust me with everything, but now... Her voice trailed off as she tried to understand why her brother no longer confided in her. Could it be that he no longer trusted her after she secretly freed the elf princess? Had he somehow caught wind of it? Or did he suspect something? What should we do? She asked desperately, looking at him pleadingly. Without my brother's trust, I lose my influence and every resource I ever had. Telsor watched her, his eyes full of sympathy, but also with a calmness that only someone who knew the world and its darker sides could possess. Finally, he placed a hand on her shoulder and said softly, "Isabella, I understand why you're upset, but isn't that exactly the game you wanted to play? Maybe there's an opportunity here." Isabella was surprised. Opportunity? For what? A faint smile played on Telsor's lips as an idea dawned on him. "Well," he began slowly, "you have a talent for political intrigue. You've proven that more than enough times. Plus, you just mastered the art of Vumara gigantism and shrinking. That alone makes you a powerful ally or adversary." He paused, as if gauging her reaction. "And I think it's time I taught you a few tricks of alchemy as well." To be continued. That was the story Escalation from the series The Legend of Blake. Subscribe to our channel for more stories like this, and please give us a thumbs up if you like the story. And if you want to support us, check out our Patreon page. Thank you.